Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lisa Hienberger. I'm a professor here at Esade. The webinar is called Walking the Tightrope: How Foundations Can Find a Balance Between Learning and Accountability Lenses. So the way we are going to run the webinar today is that I'm going to be first providing you with an introduction, and then my colleague Leonora Buckland will present the report, and then we will have a panel and Q&A after the presentation. So if you have any questions, please feel free to post those questions in the chat, and we will address those questions at the end of the webinar. And so I already introduced my colleague Leonora Buckland, who is co-author of the report and a senior researcher at the Esade Center for Social Impact. I'm the director of the Esade Center for Social Impact, and we have three amazing speakers with us. Very happy to welcome Savi Moll, who's Senior Evaluation Manager at Laudes Foundation. Also Jeremy Nichols, who's Assurance Framework Lead for SDG Impact Standards at the United Nations Development Program. And also Tine van den Sande, who's a Senior Program Coordinator and Head of Evaluation at the King Baudouin Foundation in Belgium. Very happy to have all of those speakers. I wanted to say a few words about the Esade Center for Social Impact. If you could share the screen again with the presentation, that would be great. And so we have set up this center, which is a research center at Esade Business School, and we are working towards a world in which people and organizations have the capacity to better understand and also solve complex global challenges to regenerate the environment and reduce social inequality. And we have built a synergetic research model where we are developing research with rigor, reach, and relevance about and for social impact. What that means is that we're trying to make sure that we are researching the relevant questions for practitioners and also for policymakers, and then providing solutions to them. So giving back to the ecosystem, but also, of course, using these learnings in the classroom so that we can give our students here at Esade a really wonderful experience and hands-on practical knowledge. So what is social impact? And that is really what we're researching about, and that's what we're also trying to generate. We see that as being about both positive and negative changes that are experienced by people or the planet as a result of one or several activities. And of course, we'll talk more about that because what we're working on here is really impact measurement and management, which is one of our research areas. But we also work on impact investing and impact entrepreneurship in the center. What do we mean by impact measurement and management? I already explained our definition of impact, and measurement is really about understanding if those effects are actually produced, or if those activities are actually producing effects through various methods and approaches. And we're going as well one step further and trying to understand impact management. And that is really about the systems, the processes, the culture, the capacities, capabilities of organizations that allow them to manage and optimize their impact. And I also wanted to mention that this webinar and the report that we're launching today comes out of what we call a community of practice that we have built and that we have been managing over the past more than 2 years now. And I wanted to thank BBK that has been supporting us from the very beginning with financial support, but also very much, in-kind support, participating as well actively in the community of practice. What we are trying to do with the community of practice is to cultivate transparency, knowledge sharing, and peer exchange on this topic of impact measurement and management. We realize that foundations really needed a safe space to share, what works, what doesn't work, how can they learn from each other, and how could we enable that learning, through Esade Center for Social Impact. And what we're trying to do with this community of practice is really to move the European foundation sector forward, so to provide resources, tools for the sector, but we also want to help the foundations that are part of the community of practice to learn from each other, and also to facilitate collaboration between foundations. And so we started with 2 communities of practice, one that was European with 26 foundations that you can see on this slide. But we also had 23 Spanish foundations that participated, that you can also see on the slide. We have been working separately for 2 years, and now we're working together. So all of these foundations are collaborating and trying to learn from each other. And the report that we're launching today is really a result of this learning activity that we have been working on for the past over 2 years. So this is just a brief introduction, and now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Leonora Buckland, who will be presenting the key insights.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. It's lovely to be here. So we are launching our report today. So obviously, I'm going to be giving a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of the kind of key insights from the report. But please do download it. We'll put in a link into the chat, and you can go into it in more detail. But essentially, this report is the insights from the second year. We have a report that we launched in January last year, January 2022, which was trying to summarize all of our insights from the first year. And this report is a sort of summary of our second year insights. So it's kind of building on what went before. And we've bucketed those, as it were, into 5 kind of key insights. One, which is, and I'll talk a little bit more about all of these as I go through this short presentation. The first one is really this concept of impact management being a journey. So there really aren't any kind of shortcuts, quick fixes. It's quite a long-term journey, and we'll describe that journey a bit more later. And the second point is really this is about year on year, quiet, steady progress, which we're seeing all of the foundations in our community making, and it's really sort of exciting to see that evolution over time. Of course, as they're evolving and developing, so is the kind of external landscape in terms of impact measurement and management. So there's always kind of a work there, finding out what's going on in this quite fast-moving world of impact measurement and management, but also working internally to kind of improve and go on this journey within the foundation. And the third insight we had, which has come quite a lot up in all of our conversations, is this sometimes tension or dance really between learning and accountability lenses. And we put that as the title of our report, and we'll be going into that a lot more in the panel, so I'm not going to talk about it too much in the presentation. The fourth insight we had was really around this concept of sort of devolution of the process in a way. Like I think foundations have over time started to kind of let go a bit more of the sort of command and control impact measurement and management practices that maybe were a bit more prevalent 5 or 10 years ago, and get a lot more involvement from stakeholders, which could be, of course, their grantees, their partners, but also the kind of communities that they exist to serve. So that's a really important thing that's happening, and that we believe is a really positive. And I think, academics can come up with all sorts of terms for that, like participatory governance or downward accountability. But really, it's that sort of opening up. And the final one is around what we feel philanthropy and what we're seeing our members kind of still coming up against, or sort of hitting perhaps some brick walls around. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we call the blind spots, which philanthropy needs to work on. So just to go into that first point about the journey, You can find out a lot more about this in our first report. So this is the third report that we've written on impact measurement management in the foundation sector. But in that first report, we came up with this concept of the journey and the key themes that we considered part of this journey. 5 again. I think 5 is the magic number. But the first one is the one that everyone really privileges and thinks a lot about, which is, what are the tools and the frameworks that we might be using? How do we develop our approach, theory of change, all the other tools and frameworks that we know? So that's there, but then we actually have 4 other themes which we consider to be really important. And I think the whole thrust of that research, and in a way what we've been exploring in the community of practice, is beyond the tools, beyond that kind of technical dimension, to really the cultural aspects of how do we build a organizational culture that supports impact measurement and management. How do we actually structure ourselves to deliver it? How much money do we spend on it? How do we train our staff? How do we get our trustee board to get behind us on this? So we really talk a lot about those other aspects, which perhaps I think is less part of the general dialogue, which can be, I think, quite dominated by the technical and the tools dimension. So that's the kind of value that we really want to bring to this discussion. And in that first report, we actually have a sort of whole table of what it looks like to be on that journey, what we consider to be like a beginner, an intermediate, and an advanced stage on that journey. And what we're seeing from our community of practice, I'm afraid this is quite a scary chart here, but for those of you that know the spider webs, we're seeing that there is quite a lot of progress year on year. As I said, it's not sort of huge aha transformations, but this kind of concept of slow, steady progress. So what you see here is the result of a survey that we do for our members, which I think is actually quite an important contribution to the field, because there's actually very little benchmarking at the moment about how foundations are going about impact measurement and management. So we run a survey annually to try and find out. It's a self-reported how foundations feel they're doing along the themes that we've described. And you can see that the orange and the red lines in that spider chart are for both communities together, the Spanish and European communities together. The orange was for 2021 and the red was for 2022. So you are seeing, some improvements there. Although, as I said, they're not kind of monumental or mind-blowing, but it's this kind of steady journey concept. And then the green lines are for the European community of practice, which is a little bit more, let's say, sophisticated and advanced compared to the Spanish community of practice, because I think at the European level, there's probably larger foundations, bigger budgets, and more of a kind of culture around impact measurement and management. So I think that's quite an interesting kind of snapshot of this concept of progress. And we're seeing, for example, that foundations are spending more money year on year in terms of impact measurement and management, that the average number of full-time equivalents has gone up from around about 1.5 to over 2 per foundation, and the average spend is around about 5% of the annual grant-making budget. But there's a big range from 0 to sort of 30% on that. I hope that captures this concept of progress. And in the report, we do have some case studies which actually sort of illustrate this. This one here is for Open Value Foundation, which is a Spanish foundation operating at this sort of intersect between traditional philanthropy and impact investing. And you can see that they really started on this journey in 2018, developing a theory of change. They work in in Spain, trying to support vulnerable communities on a variety of projects. And so they developed a theory of change in 2018, and over time, they've started to build on that, capture more data, work with grantees, train their staff, and actually in 2021, as it's put down here, they said they're starting to apply all of that data that they're gathering to decision making, and that's really the key point, which is let's not just collect data for accountability or compliance. I shouldn't probably use the word accountability, but and let's actually start making some strategic decisions. I mean, that's the point. And then recently in 2022, they're starting to commission external evaluations, etc. So it's this concept of kind of steady process of kind of progress and sophistication. The third insight bucket we had is around learning accountability. And we're going to talk a lot about that in our panel, so I'm going to leave that for now. And the fourth sort of insight we had is around what I talked about, this kind of devolution of power, this inclusion of more stakeholder voices in the whole impact measurement and management process. And we're very lucky to have Tina from the King Baudouin Foundation here on the panel, so I'm sure she can talk to this in a much more articulate way. But the King Baudouin Foundation is a Belgian foundation which distributed in 2021 around about over 150 million euros of grants to over 3,500 organisations. So it's a very big foundation in relative terms, and its mission is to promote a better society. And it's very interesting because it has really pioneered a kind of participatory governance, and having all of these different stakeholders, of which there are 4,610 involved in decision making around allocation of resources, but also reflection on how those resources are being used. So I think this is a really interesting example of that more participatory approach. And then Rethink Ireland is an example of a very deliberate and intentional case study of working with grantees and partners around impact measurement and management, which is kind of an essential thing for foundations to do if they want to improve their ability to manage impact, but also obviously the field. So Rethink Ireland is a over I think 92 million euro venture philanthropy fund, which works with charities and social enterprises in Ireland. It's a member of our community of practice, and they work with their grantees in quite an intentional way around impact measurement and management, helping them through consultancy, business development support, but also peer learning opportunities around this whole cycle, which they have developed to plan, evaluate, and then communicate the impact. So finally, sort of coming to the end of my very brief outline of those 5 sort of buckets of insights, which the report goes into a lot more detail on. We do feel that there are still some real blind spots that philanthropy needs to address in its impact measurement and management. One of them is around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's a whole lens there that can actually be applied to impact measurement and management to ensure that it is more responsive to communities that are served, and it includes that approach and lens. And we outline in the report how we think that can happen, and we have some examples from within the community that are really working on that. But in general, as we see across Europe, foundations, have a good long road to travel ahead in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then impact transparency, which we feel, there's a lot of reinventing the wheel. Many impact evaluations, which are expensive, as we know, are not actually shared online. We don't really hear about necessarily things that aren't working. Most foundations don't actually clearly articulate what it is they're trying to achieve and whether or how they're understanding if they're achieving their mission. So the whole sort of concept of transparency is something that's a bit of a blind spot. And then the governance of impact, which is something that we're doing a big research project about, and we hope to talk a lot more about, but that really comes to how impact data and information moves within foundations across different levels, and how impact is governed to ensure, that the most impact is achieved for the resources that each foundation has. So there is my whistle-stop tour. Just encourage you to download the report. And as I said, this is the third report. It builds on the others. So if you're new to it, you could also look at the other two reports. And we really hope that what we're discussing and finding out in this safe space is helpful for the sector. But please do get in touch if you have any questions. So I'm now going to move to Lisa, who's going to run the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leonora. So I'm very happy to be here with our three speakers. I already introduced them before, but now I'm going to ask each speaker to just briefly introduce yourself. And I'll start with Savi. If you could introduce yourself and the foundation that you work for, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Lisa. And first of all, congratulations on this very, very insightful report. I'm very privileged to be here. I'm Savi Mal, Senior Valuation Manager working with Loudus Foundation. And very briefly, Loudus Foundation is an independent foundation joining the growing movement to accelerate the transition to a climate positive and inclusive global economy. Responding to the dual crisis of climate breakdown and inequality, Loudus supports brave action that inspires and challenges industry to harness its power for good. It's founded by the Brennickmeyer family business owners and builds on 6 generations of entrepreneurship and philanthropy. We work collaboratively alongside a wider network of philanthropic organizations to both influence finance and capital markets and transform industry with a focus on the built environment and fashion sectors. Since 2020, we have been working with more than 300 partners to encourage such action.
Thank you, Savi. So I'll now turn to Tina. If you could introduce yourself and your foundation, please. You are muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Lisa. And it's for us as King Baldwin Foundation been a pleasure to be part of the community of practice since the beginning. I'm working at KBF as a senior program coordinator and head of evaluation. Our foundation is a public benefit foundation that can intervene in all areas of public interest. We are a grant-making, an operational and a community foundation with a wide-ranging mission, working together for a better society. KBF is an actor for change and innovation in Belgium, in Europe, and in the world, serving the public interest and increasing social cohesion. KBF activities cover 8 programs, 6 thematic programs from social justice and poverty to heritage and culture, from health to climate and biodiversity, education and social engagement. We have also a European program that is supporting reflections and debate on major European issues, and an international program to promote and to facilitate international philanthropy and to support actors for change in the global south. We are a connected foundation. KBF is proud to be a connected foundation. That means that the foundation works with volunteering experts, stakeholders, and citizens from the diversity of society. These volunteers are willing to share their expertise and their experience with KBF in various committees and councils and in participatory projects. KBF works with 4 impact dimensions. First, the support of the supporting the capacity building of organizations and individuals, problem structuring and raising knowledge on societal issues, forming opinions and attitudes, and finally initializing policy actions. In our foundation, impact management, impact measurement and evaluation is decentralized in the programs, towards the programs and the sub-programs, and each project coordinator is also an impact manager.
Excellent, thank you, Tina. So I'm going to turn to Jeremy, and I introduced Jeremy briefly at the beginning, but that's only one of the hats that you have been wearing, for the past years. You have really been a pioneer, in the area of social value, social return on investment, etc. So could you please introduce yourself and a little bit what you're working on now as well?
Thank you, Lisa. I was recently introduced as the grandfather of social value, which is becoming extremely depressing. I'm not even a grandfather as yet, anyway. So thank you very much, Lisa, and good morning to everybody. And it's great to be here, part of this conversation. I currently work for the UNDP on the SDG impact standards, which are surprisingly standards for managing impacts around and relating to the SDGs. They are very much management standards, though, so they cover some of the issues that we've already started talking about. So they cover governance, strategy, management, and transparency of the processes inside an organization, which we hope are those which, if you have those, if you design accordingly, you will be in a best position to maximize your contribution to sustainability and the SDGs, which is language which, we also use impact. So they're fairly transferable, I think, between those concepts. So we're very much kind of the view that we're not really organizing ourselves in a way that we make decisions designed to, thoroughly embedded, always designed to maximize that contribution. So that's what I'm doing now, and within that, I'm developing the assurance framework for those. So they're voluntary, but of course we want to be in a position that if organizations want to make the claim that they are aligned or meeting our requirements, then we will provide an assurance service indirectly for that. So you'll guess, we're big fans of third-party assurance as part of this conversation, and it'll be good to see that added in, I think, to some of the research areas that are being explored in the future. A very long time ago, I was an accountant, but I escaped accounting, and for a meandering route, I was one of the founders of an organization that has become Social Value International, which is a membership organization for people thinking about how they most effectively manage the impacts of organizations in order to maximize that impact, which is now an international community. I stepped down as the chief executive about 4, I think 5. Every time I think about that, I have to add another year, particularly with COVID thrown in as well, but an increasingly long time ago. But most of my, as Lisa said, most of my time has been spent with these questions and the questions that we're talking about today. So looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. So I'd like to now kind of get into, some of the topics that we raised in the report, and, coming straight to the sort of title of the report. We're found, through the work that we've been doing, a sort of a tension between accountability and learning. Although in some cases there seems to be no tension, in other cases there's not even a discussion about this. And the term accountability, we also noticed, in some cases, there was a bit of an issue with this term. Should we really use accountability? What does that mean? It might mean different things for different foundations. And I'd like to start with Tine, and you mentioned in your introduction that King Baudouin Foundation is a public interest foundation. So you are as well accountable, towards the people of Belgium in a way, but also you have to sort of keep the stakeholders, at the center of what you're doing. So how do you do that? How does that work in practice in the foundation?
Thank you, Lisa. I puzzled a lot with the question you raised and discussed it with colleagues for this session. And we think that it's, of course, very specific for our foundation, but we think that one way to overcome the tensions between and maybe even the paradox between accountability and learning is to move forward towards a participatory relational accountability, which fits well with the DNA of our foundation. As foundation, we are combining internal and external accountability, which means combining elements of transparency and performance accountability, but together with what we call democratic accountability. So maybe that's adding a specific accountability towards the internal accountability. And these three components of accountability, they have been, maybe I can say, framed by the researchers Patsy Krieger and Robbie Robichaud as a kind of holistic model for philanthropic accountability. So to be perceived and to be accepted as legitimate players or partners, foundations or public benefit foundations should also demonstrate that they carry out their actions based on an inclusive model of accountability that is centered around participation and dialogue with multiple stakeholders. And this is a model that also can contribute to collectively setting a political agenda. What I said can be found in the book La philanthropie, un regard européen, that has been written by two high-level experts at our foundation, Brigitte de Vieux-Serre, philanthropy advisor and head of strategy and learning, and Luc Taillard de Bormes, who has been our managing director until April 2022. That means that in the end, we seek to carefully tackle a dominant focus on accountability or control. And we are always aiming to find a balance, to find or to balance trust, learning, and accountability. Each time we seek a tailored approach, depending on whether it is the focus is on an initiative, a sub-program, or on the organization as a whole. Maybe just to tell quickly that we are quite unique in the way we organize and support collaborative learning at KBF, because its commitment to the public interest translates into a deep stakeholder engagement. More than 1,000 managing and advisory committees, steering committees and working groups and juries analyze, discuss, and validate the progress of initiatives and sub-programs inside our foundation. And these diverse groups approved, the composition of them is approved by our board or by our senior management team. They bring these diverse groups, they bring in multiple perspectives and often contribute to shared learnings. So, and it allows us, staff, KBF staff, to be more responsive and adaptive to changing environments, changing circumstances of ongoing initiatives. So in other words, these volunteering experts and stakeholders, they are playing an indispensable role in monitoring and evaluation processes. And to end, maybe it's also fair to say that the data on the composition, on the experts and the and stakeholders and citizens, the current data show that there is still room for improvement when it comes to diversity in juries and committees.
Thank you, Tina. And I think that really illustrates in a way, the unique culture of King Baudouin Foundation, and the way that you have developed over the years, to really take the stakeholder perspective. So that was really interesting. And I wanted to now turn to Savi. And I know that in terms of accountability, you think, really about a link between accountability and learning, and really talking about even being accountable for learning. Could you explain a little bit what that means?
Thanks, Lisa. When I was reflecting about what do I share on this topic, I went back to several years back when I was working with an international organization, and one of the roles that I was tasked with was to make sure that I get information from 14 research institutes that are part of a program funded by a development cooperation agency for over 5 years. And I would get the information, put the information in the format that the development cooperation agency sent us every year, and sent it off to the director. And the director would go ahead and send it to where it needed to go. And in that, I just saw that it's just a flow of information, a transaction, to make sure that we continue to get funding for those 5 years for the research that these 14 institutes in developing countries were doing. So for me, that is what I would say is the traditional notion of accountability. And being in Lauder's Foundation, I would also want to use the metaphor of, and this is again going back to the classroom in school, is where the teacher always told us the poets have a poetic license. And I think when we are in the philanthropic space, we have philanthropic license. And what do I mean when I say that? When we are in this space of philanthropy, we also then have the license to power up learning alongside accountability. And this is also very essential when we look at the fact that we are working on contribution to systems change. That we do not only need to know where we are, but we also need to know how we need to adapt. And this is where I'll quote Lee Alexander Frisbee, who's the director of effective philanthropy at Lauder's Foundation. He coined the term called accountable learning. That really helps us use the intelligence we have to also learn. But then you would bear the question, Savi, what is really then accountable learning? How do you see that unfold? And I'll talk to 3 points. The first one is that we have at Lauder's Foundation very intentionally embraced a new measurement and learning framework called the rubrics that really help us, understand the complexity that we work in, the context that we work in. And this framework allows us not only to understand the progress or the contribution to change, but also look at what adaptations we need to make to become more effective. So we've embraced this over the last 2 years. And while we've been on this journey with this new measurement and learning framework called the rubrics, the second thing that we've done is also brought up partners along in the journey, because we recognize that partners are doing the same thing that I was doing a few years back. They're just reporting to make sure that the financing is in place and there's a power relation there. And what we've made sure is then in the reporting guidelines to have questions that would help partners to learn, to have that moment of reflection as they are writing the report, and then also have conversations with our program managers to really make sense of what is changing, why, and how do we still need to improve and adapt. So that brings in the element of adaptive management as well at that level. And the third point that I want to make is this is not easy. Impact is not easy. We're not doing anything that is easy at all. It's been a journey for us to bring along staff at the foundation, including our partners, to make this transformational mindset and move away from this scary word of evaluation, measurement, performance, and go more towards accountable learning, where we are learning as well, while we're also knowing where we are on that journey.
Yeah. Thank you, Savid. And I think it's interesting as well how you refer to your grantees, in a way as partners, which is, I think, reflects as well the type of culture that you have built, in the foundation. I wanted to now turn to Jeremy and ask you, and I know that you have been speaking quite a lot about accountability. You you spoke about accountability as well in our meeting in Bilbao with the community of practice. So do you have examples of organizations that you think are really being accountable to those that they serve, which I think, in a way, is something that you have spoken a lot about as being something that foundations and all mission-driven organizations should work towards, right?
Yeah, you're right. I'm a bit of a stuck record on this subject, and it was interesting to me when I saw the report, because this idea of that tension between learning and accountability, to be honest, was very much a new one for me. And both of the words, kind of accountability and learning, I thought had some kind of bits around it which we could perhaps tease out a little more. And certainly all my work has always been rooted in this, as Tina was saying, around stakeholder participation, stakeholder engagement, stakeholder involvement, words that can mean different things, but intrinsically have always been around recognizing that there are power imbalances, and that what we are, or should be, I think about, is shifting power. And of course, shifting power is never easy, because those with power tend to find reasons not to give it away to those who have less, because then they're going to have less too, and the other lot are going to have more. So to be honest, actually, all the experience of organizations that I've worked in and been around on this subject have not seen it as a tension. From the reverse, actually, would say generally that that it is that stakeholder involvement and being held to account that actually drives learning, but that learning in itself is not the end point. And to be honest, it does make me a bit nervous, because I've seen many organizations, or spoken to many organizations, where if asked, have you learned anything, people say, yeah, we've learned loads. And then you say, well, have you changed anything? And then it goes a bit quiet. And so I do think, I actually personally prefer the idea of changing organizations than learning, to make sure we're actually hanging on to where that goes. But I was chair of an organization called Accountability for some years. So we were very much of the view that accountability was a requisite for driving innovation and change. I was on the board of a social investor who gave out a mix of grants and loans equally. The work with Social Value International has always been, you can read endlessly about how accountability is at the root of training in order to drive change. And that's also part of the UNDP's work, is that not only is it about responding to stakeholders, but if you are empowering them, they have expectations as to what they think should be happening, and most importantly, at what rate it should be happening. And I think the rate question is, how fast are we making these changes? How fast are we responding? How fast are we learning? Also tend to get missed. But if you are actually accountable, they are inescapable. And so the example, kind of a very practical example, is a social enterprise that I'm on the board of, which again would say the same, but doesn't really see that there's a tension. So I think it's going to be interesting to kind of tease that bit out a bit. And we're moving very much towards this idea of if we're informed by our stakeholders, and if we're engaging with them, and if we're empowering them, then we're getting, when we talk about impact data, we generally mean information that has come from our stakeholders, and that is a source of ideas. It's a resource. And so our question, which we now systemize, not well, but we've started to systemize at board level, is how many ideas have we had throughout the organization, informed by stakeholders, and how many of those have we actually implemented, which allows us to start thinking about the type and quality, but also rate of response, the rate at which we are learning, but most importantly, changing. And I think that is quite a kind of basic metric, which is quite useful. And it's also one actually, which in another world, which I'm also involved in, is the International Standards Organizations. And there's a standard there on governance of organizations called ISO 37000. And yet again, accountability is seen as a driver of learning and change rather than a tension with it. So I'm sitting there thinking, well, why is there this happened that we feel that there's a tension? And it's already come up in the conversation, I think, where we've started to use words for different types of accountability and kind of learning-based accountability. And we can frame those. I'm not sure we should multiply types of accountability, to be honest. I think we should more probably think about a continuum from organizations where there is no accountability to organizations where there is good accountability. And we should be better able to think about what does good accountability look like. And I kind of ended up thinking, well, maybe the reason this is happening, because we're not being clear about who we're accountable for and what we're accountable for. And so if we're being held to account as organizations for did we spend the money on doing things, then that would seem to be not that useful. Whereas on the other hand, if we were being held to account by the people whose lives we purport or hope or expect to change for the better, and for making sure that increase in the better is as fast as possible, with whatever constraints obviously we have to reflect on, but nonetheless that should be our sort of starting point. And that seems to me to be not a good accountability, and an accountability that would start to not only drive learning, because you'd have to change. And I think, being held to account, and you said this is not easy, this is hard. And to be honest, I think so much of this is about our human psychological, just being human, really. We find it very hard. We don't actually like being held to account. It's really uncomfortable. And so if we don't have to be, it's a very human thing to tend to find reasons not to be. And what we're trying to do, I think, a lot of the time when we think about the governance of this issue, we think about how we manage impact, is actually force or allow or permit other people to seriously hold us to account. And when you do that, they say, well, we want things to change now. And we want things to change that you didn't actually want to change, but sorry, that's how it's going to work now. And do you know what? We also want it to change rather quicker than it has been. So you better all get a move on and start getting yourself organized to find ways and think through things that you can do and make the best choice you can to improve things as fast as possible. So I just wondered whether maybe the tension is as much about a tension between learning and not great accountability as it would be good accountability removing that tension.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on, and when we think about tension between accountability and learning, it's really this type of accountability that is about, how did we spend our money? And I think a lot of the sort of what Leonora referred to as upward accountability is like reporting to the board, but on maybe more financial aspects rather than really on the impact. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing in the research that we're currently doing on governance, as a sort of a barrier as well to learning, when accountability is framed in such a narrow way. So thinking about accountability much more broadly and focusing on the key stakeholder groups that you're trying to serve, I think, naturally connects well with learning. So, on that note, and I think we only have 10 minutes left of this webinar, so I wanted to ask each of you if you have any recommendations, because there are lots of foundations that are joining this webinar and that will listen to the webinar that perhaps are in different situations. So Leonora talked about a learning journey. So some are perhaps just in the beginning of starting to implement impact measurement and management. Others are more advanced. But from your experience, are there any things that you would recommend for foundations to do, in terms of kind of getting started on this journey of actually implementing an impact management approach that allows you to learn, and as Jeremy mentioned, allows you as well to take action, because it's not just about learning, but it's also about changing the way that you work so that you can optimize your impact. I know that's a bit of a difficult question, but maybe based on the experience in your foundations of introducing changes, and I think Savi, you mentioned how it's not easy, and could you perhaps share some of the things that you have been doing at Loudest Foundations? You talked about rubrics and other things as well.
Thanks, Lisa, and I'll be brief. I think there are 2 points. The first is, and this is also what has been referred to in the report that has been launched, the impact diplomats that you would have, and I know Tinez also mentioned that as well, right? Is to have, and we have this at the foundation, learning champions. So there are learning champions positioned in each of the teams who basically champion evidence, create time for reflection, create a safe space as well. And that is one tip that could help. And the other one is also, because I understand and I've interacted with a lot of the foundations in Bilbao, is when you're small also, this great architecture may not even look super, but just start with reflecting during the annual report process as well. And that's done annually. So it's also a good point to look at where the foundations are, where we are in terms of our goals, and then take it forward from there. Those are the 2 hacks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. And I just wanted to mention as well that if anyone has questions that of the participants at this webinar, you can post those questions in the chat and we'll try to address them. And we can go a little bit over time if you have questions. So don't hesitate to post those questions. I wanted to turn to Tine, and I know that when we had conversations as well about your work at King Baudouin Foundation and the aspect of learning, you also mentioned that you need to have these spaces. You need to actually have time to reflect and incorporate, some of these learnings, actually analyze the data. Could you share maybe some of your experiences from your foundation as well?
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, it's a challenge. It stays always a challenge, even if you are a bigger foundation. So there is no difference, I think, in the end. And I'm sorry if I repeat something, but it's about creating space and time. And that's the most important. Our foundation is growing a lot since a number of years. So the risk is that we are too operational and that we have not enough free time creating these spaces for really deep learning. And I think that's something that we need to safeguard and continuously update the way we are doing this. I think that's important. I can give some examples if there's still time, but maybe another one is also embrace the failures. It's in the meantime, it's quite traditional to say that, but it's not, even after a number of years trying to celebrate the failures inside our foundation, very discreet, with the KBF staff. Even after these years, we cannot say that kind of openness is already acquired in our foundation. So it's an iterative process again and again. But maybe that's to enter is that to all staff members in foundations or social entrepreneurs is we are not the experts at our foundations. We are trying to become reflective practitioners. That's what we are. That's in the DNA of our foundation. And we always say that we spend a lot of time on puzzling. That's something that and puzzling is also learning. It's really studying. it's problem finding, problem structuring of societal issues. That's something that is really key in our job. And then when we talk about evaluation, we move towards becoming or working with evaluation bricoleurs. The bricolage culture is coming up together with developmental evaluation, but the bricolage is becoming much more important than it was before, because standardization is not the way to go forward. I think that it's now about customization and contextualization. These concepts are key, but it becomes a really artisanal profession to be a bricoleur in evaluation.
Oh, thank you, Tin. And I like that concept of evaluation bricoleur. There's a question in the audience, and that's from Natalia. She asks, can you share about grantees' experience in engaging on IMM with your foundation? How much value did they find in this, level of effort, worth their time, etc.? So that's, I guess, a question for Savi and Tine, but while you reflect on that, I'll also give Jeremy a chance to jump in if you had any additional comments.
Well, quick tips. So for the social enterprise I was talking about, FRC, the starting point for this was very much governance and board with the CEO and the management team. And it was when we moved from saying, did we have an impact, to which the obvious answer was yes, to are we having as much impact as we can, to which the obvious answer was no. And that massively changed the culture and the way we started thinking about this, because immediately you had to start saying, well, what are we going to do about that? That moved towards, and I think then from a foundation's perspective, and we've looked at this from a kind of, or even from any kind of investor funder's perspective, is do we want to be funding organizations that have a perfect impact report produced with the help of the marvelous consultancy Impact Superiorness, and with the support of the professor of impact, kind of reviewing it? Or would we rather be supporting organizations that are clearly responding fast to their stakeholders, even if they don't have perfect information? There's a bit of a balance in that. But we've moved to the latter and started to count it. And I think that's about accountability, is counting things. How many ideas do the organizations we fund have, and how many did they actually implement? Is not that hard to start collecting, Now, and for FRC, we're going down that journey, and it's, the kind of way we think about these things from a funder's point of view and within UNDP. The next step for us would be the uncomfortable one, I think, where we say, what is our target for how many changes we'll make? Because we do also believe that accountability gets tied up with targets. And if you don't meet targets, there are consequences. And if you don't set targets, there's never any consequences, because you're always fine, whatever you do. And so there you are. I would move to asking those two questions. How many ideas did you have, and how many did you actually implement? And then setting targets for those over time. And I think we'll get along a lot faster.
Thank you, Jeremy. Savi and Tine, did you have any response to the question that was in the chat?
Yes, and thank you, Natalia. I want to say that the experience of working with our partners on rubrics has been mixed. And again, it's a transformational mindset shift from counting, KPI-focused orientation, to moving more towards what are the partners' contribution, what is their contribution story through the initiatives that they are working on. And it's not easy, because the traditional mindset has always been counting the number of policies changed, but not on what changes when the policy has changed. So some have really embraced the new framework that we have. And for others, we continue to work with them. We're also going to do clinics with our partners. We call them clinics, as in, you can come up with questions. Because we really want to make sure that it's, again, not burdensome for them as well.
Thank you, Savi. Tine?
With a number of grantees or our partners, we are working within learning networks that we are creating for maybe 2-3 years or even longer. And this is the way to build together knowledge, but also reflecting on what we learned, how we should move forward. So it's again in an indirect way that we involve them in impact measurement and management. It can be it is at the level of an initiative or a sub-program. It's less the case at the level of our foundation.
Thanks so much. Okay, well, I guess we're drawing to the end of the time now. Sorry, I didn't see Lisa there, so I jumped in.
For some reason, I was kicked out. But
yeah, Lisa, maybe you want to wrap up briefly, and yeah, if there are any questions, we are happy to stay for a few minutes, but it doesn't seem that there are any additional questions, so maybe we can wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you so much. First of all, to our speakers, for joining, for all your contributions, also to all the work that we've been doing, in these past years. Also, thank you to BBK for supporting our work, and to the Esade team for organizing the webinar, and of course to all the participants for joining us today. I think it's been a really informative session, and we of course encourage you to download the report and read more about it. And if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out to us. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you today.